Welcome back. In this lecture, we want to answer some of the famous questions. What are some of the questions that people ask the most? The first one is, what was the problem in 2 Thessalonians? What problem was Paul trying to address? And there are so many things that Paul said, but I want to bring it down to this one thing. Paul was addressing idleness. There were people who had given up their job, they had stopped working, and they rather will go begging instead of having a job. And then the second question answers it a little bit further, because the second question is, what was the purpose of the letter? Now, the purpose of the letter was really to deal with idleness, but not to deal with it on a surface level. No, to deal with idleness at its root. So now, what was the root of idleness? That's what's important, right? Apparently, people were talking about two things. One was that the second coming of Jesus has already come. So that just destroyed the hope of some, right? Another one was that, because Jesus is coming, there's no point doing anything. And Paul addresses both. It says to those who think Jesus has come, he says, hey, hang on, the man of lawlessness has not appeared, because when he does appear, you would instinctively know this is the tribulation period, this is the end time, this is Jesus' second coming. And it deals with those who say, well, Jesus is coming, so there's no point. No, it says that's not how you live. In other words, he kind of gave them instructions. So the book of 2 Thessalonians was dealing with idleness at its root. If we move forward, the third question is about why was a letter written so soon after the first one? Bible scholars tell us that the letter was written in AD 51, or both letters were written in AD 51. If that's been the case, then it was not too long after the first one was written before the second one also was detailed by Paul. So why is that? The reason is that the problem persisted. This problem was present in the first letter. People were idle in the first letter. Paul was encouraging them to make sure they worked. But now, when Timothy came back and reported what was going on, Paul still realized that they still were not working at all. At least some of them were not and preferred to beg. And then another question that people ask the most is, who persecuted the church of the Thessalonians? Who was persecuting the church? Well, in my knowledge, I would say the Jews who followed Paul around and ensured that they caused trouble for him, and the local people were those who were persecuting the church in, by the time we read 2nd, even 1st Thessalonians as well. Okay, let's go on to another section of introduction. It's about the place. Thessalonica. What was it like? Well, if you take a look at this map, you would see where Thessalonica is, or Macedonia is, and Thessalonica is just by my right, so I'm looking at it right here, and it's near Berea. Remember that Paul left Thessalonica and then went to Berea afterwards, and the Bible tells us that the Christians in Berea, they were of more noble character than those of Thessalonica, because they studied their Bible every day to check whether the things that Paul said were true. But the Thessalonians, they suffered a lot as new believers. So let's take a look a little bit more about what the place consisted of. Well, Thessalonica was one of the most populous cities. It was the most populous city in Macedonia at the time. It was a prominent Roman colony, and Paul had great success there. In fact, the Bible tells us that in Acts chapter 17, that many prominent people followed Paul after he witnessed Christ in that particular city. Now, we now can go on to who wrote the book. The book, it says from the beginning, it's Paul, Silas, and Timothy. It tells us that in verse 1. So we can also know, because at the end, Paul says in chapter 3, verse 17, it says, I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hands, which is the distinguishing mark in all my letters. this is how I write. So Paul not only thought about what to write, he actually also penned it, as opposed to maybe the book of Romans, which was penned by Antichrist, I believe, because Paul was dictating, somebody else was writing, but in this one, he was actually doing the writing. And of course, Silas and Timothy were there with him, probably making some form of contribution as well. To whom was it written? Who was the letter written to? Of course, the letter was written to the church in Thessalonica or Thessalonica, and definitely this book was also written to us, because when we begin to look at the lessons that we derive from this book, we understand instinctively that we can learn a lot from this book. So we're going to now dive into the letter when we come back. So see you in a moment.